There is something out there watching you, studying you, something that knows your deepest fears, your most hidden desires, and knows exactly when you're at your most vulnerable. And this thing is not human in any way you'd recognize. It might be wearing the face of someone who smiles at you every single day. It might be that voice inside your own head, the one that tells you you're not good enough, you don't deserve it, you're never going to make it. And what makes all of this so deeply unsettling is that Jesus knew about this force. He left behind precise, almost surgical warnings about how to identify these disguised entities, but those warnings were buried, distorted, and erased through centuries of religious and cultural manipulation. This is not another vague spiritual theory video. This is not speculation. This is not the kind of content you're going to find at a Sunday service or a megachurch with upbeat music and group hugs. What you're about to see is drawn from the oldest texts ever written about Jesus, documents that were excluded from the official Bible, hidden inside clay jars in the middle of the Egyptian desert, preserved by groups of people who paid with torture and death to make sure this truth was never destroyed forever. We're talking about the Archons. Now, before you write this off as Greek mythology or sci-fi, let me ask you a few direct questions. Have you ever been in a relationship that left you completely drained, no energy, no motivation, no real way to explain why? Have you ever worked in an environment where your creativity and your joy just evaporated for no logical reason? Have you ever been close to someone and felt, almost physically, a kind of heaviness and an emptiness, a suffocating weight you couldn't put a name to? That has a name. It has an origin described in texts over 2,000 years old, and it has a solution that Jesus revealed in specific detail, one you're going to understand by the end of this video. You probably made it here because you felt something, a restlessness you've been carrying for a while. The sense that certain situations keep repeating themselves in your life in strange ways, like there's something beyond the visible operating around you. And you are absolutely right to feel that. The topic of this video is one of the most powerful and least discussed aspects of Jesus' spiritual teachings. We're going to talk about the Archons, these forces that disguise themselves as people, as situations, even as thoughts, that feed on human energy, and that Jesus identified with a precision that genuinely sends chills down the spines of serious scholars who study these ancient texts. You're going to understand where this concept came from, how it actually works, how to recognize these influences in your real life, and what to do when you encounter them. This content is going to change how you see relationships, environments, your own choices, and even the thoughts that surface in your mind during your hardest moments. If you want to understand a spirituality that goes far beyond what you've been told, you're exactly where you need to be right now. If you've already felt that there's something nobody's telling you about the spiritual world, go ahead and hit like on this video. That simple gesture helps this channel keep existing and reaching more people who need this message. Subscribe and hit the bell too, because what's coming on this channel is exactly the kind of content that shifts your perspective permanently. And drop the word Archon in the comments below if you're ready to go deeper into this revelation. I want to see how many people are ready for this truth. If what you're hearing right now has already shifted something inside you, imagine what's waiting in the digital book I've pinned in the first comment. It's not a summary of what you're going to see here. It's what doesn't fit in a video. Go check it out now. It could come down at any time. To understand what Jesus revealed about the Archons, we first need to understand who these entities were within the oldest spiritual thinking, and why this knowledge is just as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago. Because this story doesn't start with Jesus. It starts much earlier, and the traces of it are scattered across every major tradition of the ancient world, waiting for someone with open eyes to connect them. The word Archons from Greek and means ruler or one who dominates. In the context of the first centuries of Christianity, especially within the Gnostic movements that flourished from Egypt to Syria, the Archons were described as spiritual entities who acted as rulers of this material world. They weren't simply demons in the way popular tradition pictures them, hideous creatures with horns and pitchforks. They were something far more subtle, far more sophisticated, and because of that, far more dangerous. They were entities that operated through disguise, through imitation, through spiritual mimicry. The Gnostic texts, especially those discovered at Nag Hammadi, Egypt, in 1945, described the Archons as beings created by a demiurgic entity, a lesser and imperfect force that shaped the material world without access to the fullness of the original divine light. The Archons, therefore, did not possess the inner spark of light that characterizes genuine human consciousness. They were, in essence, hollow beings. And because they were hollow, because they had no internal source of vital energy, they became parasites of the light that humanity carried within itself. This concept might feel far removed from your everyday reality. But hold on, because the way the Archons operate hasn't changed one bit since these texts were written. What's changed is the scenery, the stage, the masks they wear. To understand where this knowledge came from and why it reached us in such a fragmented, distorted form, I need to take you to a specific moment in history. In 1945, a young farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Salman was digging near a cliff at Jabal al-Tarif in Upper Egypt. He found a sealed clay jar buried deep in the arid desert soil. Inside that jar were 12 codices, ancient books bound in camel leather, containing more than 50 texts that no one had seen in centuries, maybe millennia. These texts are known today as the Nag Hammadi Library, and they literally rock the worlds of archaeology, theology, and the history of Christianity. Among those documents were the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and the Secret Book of John, texts that describe in stunning detail not just the Gnostic cosmology, but teachings attributed to Jesus that were never included in the canonical Gospels. And in those texts, the Archons appear again and again as one of the central spiritual concerns Jesus addressed with his closest disciples, in private conversations, away from the crowds. If this message has strengthened your faith, brought peace to your heart, or helped you in any way, know that you can also help us keep spreading content like this. Producing these messages takes time, dedication, and a tremendous amount of work to bring words of hope to more and more people. If you feel in your heart the desire to support this mission, I've left a link in the first pinned comment. Any contribution, no matter the size, helps us keep this work alive and reach lives around the world. May God multiply back to you double everything you sow in love. If these texts are authentic, and the manuscripts are over 1,600 years old, tested and confirmed through rigorous scientific dating in multiple international laboratories, then there exists a conversation that Jesus had with his closest followers about entities that steal energy, manipulate human consciousness, and disguise themselves in ways that human beings can't easily detect. That conversation was recorded, it was preserved at the cost of human lives, and it very nearly was destroyed forever. But why were these texts hidden? Why aren't they part of the Bible we know today? Here is something very few people know, and it's going to start explaining a lot about the history of official Christianity and about what was deliberately kept out of the public eye. In the year 325 AD, Emperor Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea, where it was decided, through both political and religious hands, what would and would not be included in the official Christian Bible. Out of over 100 texts circulating among the Christian communities of the time, only a small fraction was selected. And the criteria weren't purely theological, they were also, and perhaps primarily, political. The texts that spoke of direct access to the divine, of inner knowledge, of spiritual awakening without institutional intermediaries, of discernment that made the individual sovereign over their own spirituality, those texts represented a direct threat to the centralized power of the Church that was being built as an instrument of social control. The Gnostic texts were declared heretical. The communities that preserved them were persecuted, their members tortured, their leaders killed. Manuscripts were burned in public squares. And the memory of this knowledge was gradually erased, fragmented, and ridiculed across generation after generation, until the Egyptian desert gave back what they had tried to permanently destroy. What's written in those recovered texts isn't simply abstract cosmology or a mythological system with no practical application. It's a map, a functional description of how invisible forces operate on human consciousness, how they disguise themselves to avoid detection, how they feed, and crucially, how they can be identified with precision and resisted effectively. Jesus appears in these texts not merely as a generic spiritual teacher, but as someone who came specifically to reveal this hidden dynamic to humanity, to hand people the tools of discernment that would free them from archonic control. And here is the one piece of information that will stay with you for the rest of this video. These teachings were not suppressed by accident. They were not forgotten through historical carelessness. They were suppressed because they work. Because a humanity that knows how to recognize a disguised Archon is a humanity that cannot be controlled through fear, guilt, spiritual dependency, and chronic energy depletion. And what comes next is going to show you exactly what Jesus said, word for word, in the text that survived, about how to identify these forces when they show up in front of you. Now we get to the core of what needs to be said, what Jesus specifically revealed about the Archons, their disguises, and how human beings can recognize them before the energy theft happens. In the Secret Book of John, one of the most complete and best preserved texts found at Nag Hammadi, there is an account that genuinely stops people cold the first time they read it. John the Apostle is deep in grief after the death and resurrection of Jesus, disturbed by questions he cannot answer when he receives a vision. In that vision, Jesus appears to him, not in physical form, but as light, and reveals a complete cosmology, the origin of the universe, the nature of the human being, the origin of the divine spark imprisoned within matter. And within that extraordinary revelation, Jesus describes the archons in detail that none of the canonical gospels so much as hints at. Jesus describes the archons as beings who have the appearance of luminous angels, who can take on convincing human forms, who speak with a voice of authority and wisdom, who simulate benevolence and care with frightening perfection. But there is one fundamental trait that distinguishes them, that inevitably gives them away, that Jesus points to with the precision of someone who knows the enemy intimately. They do not have real love. They can imitate love. They can reproduce the gestures, the words, the outward rituals of affection. But true love, the kind that rises from a genuine inner spark of light, the kind that gives without demanding, that strengthens without controlling, that sets free instead of binding, that they cannot produce in any authentic or sustained way. And if you pay the right kind of attention, at the right moments, you will notice that difference unmistakably. How does this show up in practice? How do you recognize someone who is being used as a vehicle for an archon, or who is directly under the influence of one of these forces? Jesus, in the Gnostic texts, offers specific markers that are disturbingly precise for the world we live in today, 2,000 years later. The first marker is what the texts call the theft of light. A disguised archon will always steer the conversation, the relationship, every dynamic in a way that has you surrendering your energy, your time, your attention, your emotional life, without getting anything equivalent in return. This isn't necessarily someone who seems malicious on the surface. They may be extremely charismatic, magnetic, full of stories and presence, but at the end of every interaction, you feel smaller, more exhausted, more confused about yourself, while the other person seems energized, strengthened, fed by the exchange. The second marker is the manipulation of inner judgment. An archon operates with maximum efficiency when you can't think clearly about your own situation. The texts describe how these entities inject thoughts of doubt, fear, shame, and inadequacy, not as an outside voice you can recognize as foreign, but as if they were your own thoughts, rising from within, born from your own experience. Jesus specifically instructs the disciples to develop what the texts call discernment of the Spirit, the ability to observe your own thoughts from a distance and honestly ask, did this come from me, or was it placed here by something external? The third marker cuts directly against everything conventional religious thinking teaches, which is exactly why it's so unsettling. A disguised archon frequently uses religious, moral, and spiritual language with mastery. They say the right words at the right moments. They quote sacred texts with authority. They present themselves as spiritual guides, as defenders of the faith, as protectors of truth. Jesus, in the Gospel of Thomas, says something that very few preachers have the courage to quote. If your leaders tell you that the kingdom is in the sky, then the birds will get there before you. If they say it's in the sea, then the fish will get there before you. The kingdom is within you. That statement is a direct declaration against any system that places mandatory intermediaries between you and the divine, and the archons. According to these texts, love to operate through exactly those kinds of systems of spiritual intermediation that breed dependency. The fourth marker is control through chronic suffering. The Gnostic texts describe the archons as entities that feed especially on low-frequency emotions, fear, guilt, shame, suppressed rage, existential despair. A disguised archon will create and perpetuate situations, dynamics, and systems that keep you trapped in those emotions continuously. And it will do this in ways that feel natural, inevitable, even spiritually necessary. It will convince you that suffering is a sign of spiritual depth, that your constant guilt makes you more humble before God, that your permanent fear is simply wise caution. Jesus, in the Gospel of Philip, says something extraordinary that deserves to be heard out loud. Light and darkness, life and death, right and wrong, these are siblings to one another, and it is impossible to truly separate one from the other. So neither those who appear to be good are entirely good, nor those who appear to be evil are entirely evil. This isn't cheap moral relativism. It is a precise and urgent warning. The archon doesn't show up looking like a monster. It shows up mixed in with the good. It shows up wearing virtue as a mask, using love as bait, using spirituality as a tool of control. These four markers, the theft of vital energy, the manipulation of inner judgment, the strategic use of sacred language, and control through chronic suffering, form the core of what Jesus revealed about how to identify these disguised forces in everyday life. And when you start applying these markers to your own life, your relationships, the environments you live in, and the systems you participate in, things start making sense in a way they simply never did before. Like puzzle pieces suddenly snapping into place, revealing a picture that was there the whole time. But there's an even deeper layer to this revelation, something Jesus left specific about the moment when an Archon dramatically intensifies its efforts. There is a moment in every human being's spiritual journey when you become a priority target for these forces. And that moment is exactly the moment you're living in right now as you watch this video. Some people watch, enjoy it, and move on. Others want to go deeper. If you're in the second group, the digital book is in the first pinned comment. Click now. Here's where things get genuinely unsettling. Because if you thought the Archons were an abstract spiritual concept confined to hard-to-access ancient texts, what I'm about to show you is going to permanently and irreversibly change that perception. We live in the most technologically advanced era in recorded human history. We have access to more information than any generation before us in every field of knowledge. And paradoxically, we are living through a crisis of mental health, relationships, existential purpose, and personal energy that is unprecedented in history. Rates of chronic anxiety, depression, emotional burnout, and inner emptiness have never been higher in absolute terms, and the overwhelming majority of conventional approaches treat this as a purely chemical, behavioral, or social problem, but rarely as what the ancient texts and Jesus specifically pointed to: a spiritual war happening on a planetary scale, with methods that have adapted perfectly to modernity. The Greek philosopher Plato, more than 350 years before Christ, was already describing entities he called intermediary demons, beings that existed between the human world and the divine world that influenced people's thoughts and emotions without them perceiving the source of that influence. Ancient Judaism described the Sheddim, entities that fed on human energy through fear and the superstition that fear generates. The Islamic tradition has the jinn, beings that can take on convincing human forms and influence minds from the inside out. Indigenous peoples across dozens of cultures around the world, with no contact with each other, speak of spirits that attach to people and gradually drain them of vitality, joy, and clarity. None of these completely independent traditions invented the same concept without something real behind those collective and individual experiences. The common thread running through all these radically different cultures is exactly what Jesus described with the greatest precision and structure. Entities that disguise themselves effectively, that feed on human energy in a parasitic way, and that can be identified and resisted through inner knowledge and active spiritual discernment. But here's the pattern-breaking reality that absolutely nobody is discussing with the seriousness it deserves. In the contemporary world, the Archons no longer need exclusively physical bodies to operate at maximum efficiency. The Gnostic texts describe the Archons as masters of fabricating illusion, entities that create systems of artificial reality to keep humanity permanently distracted, confused, fragmented, and drained of its highest energy. And if you look at the structures of the contemporary world through that lens, with the discernment tool that Jesus handed over, you will see something you were never able to see before. Think about media and social media systems that run on continuous, constantly refreshed outrage, that keep you in a permanent state of anger and fear, because anger and fear generate more engagement, more time surrendered, more attention drained. Think about economic systems that have normalized exhaustion as the highest virtue: work more, rest less, measure your worth exclusively by what you produce, never by what you are. Think about toxic relational patterns that perpetuate themselves through cycles of idealization, devaluation, and discard that teach you that you constantly need to earn the right to be loved, to be accepted, to exist with dignity. These systems weren't necessarily built with conscious malicious intent by every individual involved in them, but they function with remarkable efficiency, exactly as the Gnostic texts describe the systems created and maintained by Archons: to drain, to confuse, and to keep humanity cut off from its original inner light. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychoanalyst who studied the Gnostic texts with exceptional depth and academic seriousness, called the Archons autonomous complexes, psychic patterns that operate within the human psyche independently of the individual's consciousness, that temporarily hijack a person's identity and act on their own, with their own voice and their own motivations. He saw in the Gnostic description of the Archons not a mythological cosmology of merely historical value, but a precise and clinically usable map of the deep structure of the human psyche. And he said something that never leaves the memory of whoever hears it. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. That is precisely what Jesus revealed. That is what the Gnostic texts transmitted across generations of persecution and sacrifice. The path to real spiritual liberation doesn't begin with external rituals. It doesn't begin with belonging to the right denomination or institution. It doesn't begin with accumulating intellectual knowledge about cosmology. It begins with the act of seeing, of naming what is operating, of bringing into conscious light what operates in the shadows of your life and your psyche. And it is exactly this act, simple to describe, deeply courageous in practice, that archonic forces most fear and most work to prevent. Because an entity that survives in disguise does not survive when the light is turned on honestly and with determination. That is the weapon Jesus handed to his closest disciples. That is the tool that was suppressed for centuries with systematic violence. And that is the tool you already carry inside you at this very moment. Have you recognized any of these dynamics in your own life? That relationship that completely drained you without you being able to explain why? That work environment that gradually extinguished your inner light and your creativity? That recurring, destructive thought that didn't really seem to come from you, that arrived from outside but settled in as though it were yours? If you're recognizing any of these things as you listen to these words, write the word AWAKE in the comments below. I want to see how many people are waking up to this reality right now, because the next point is going to reveal something about these ancient texts and about Jesus' teachings that you've probably never been told, and that will permanently change the way you see your own spiritual journey and the forces acting upon it from this day forward. The evidence that supports the reality of the Archons isn't confined only to the Gnostic texts of Nag Hammadi. It shows up in layers, in traditions separated by oceans and centuries, in archaeological discoveries that continue to surprise researchers to this day, and in fields of knowledge you would never expect to find confirmation for something this ancient. Let's start with what archaeology and history have documented. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered at Qumran between 1947 and 1956, contain texts from the Essene community, a Jewish group that was contemporary with Jesus, that describes in detail a cosmic war between forces of light and forces of darkness that operate through entities capable of influencing human minds. The Damascus document, part of these scrolls, speaks directly of beings who plant thoughts in human consciousness to steer people away from the path of light. That description is functionally identical to what the Gnostic texts call archonic operation. Origen of Alexandria, one of the greatest Christian theologians of the 3rd century, wrote extensively about the Archons in his work Against Celsus, attempting to refute the Gnostic view but paradoxically confirming that this was a central discussion within early Christianity. He describes how the Gnostics believed these entities governed different spheres of the cosmos, and that the soul's return to its divine origin required precise knowledge of how to identify them and how to pass through their influence without being captured by it. The fact that an official theologian had to dedicate so much effort to refuting this concept is, in itself, evidence of how widespread and how seriously it was taken at the time. Irenaeus of Lyon, in the 2nd century, wrote a treatise called Against Heresies, whose primary target was the Gnostic traditions. And in that text, in trying to refute them, he ended up describing them with a richness of detail that would have otherwise been lost to history. Thanks to Irenaeus trying to destroy these ideas, we know today exactly what the Gnostics taught about the Archons, about their methods of disguise, and about the discernment techniques Jesus had transmitted. The attempt at erasure preserved what it was trying to eliminate. Every video on this channel is created with dedication to bring hope, spiritual direction, and biblical teachings to those who need it. If you believe in this mission, please consider a donation of any amount. Your support keeps this channel active and allows more lives to be reached. Link in the pinned comment. But the evidence doesn't stop in the religious and historical realm. Contemporary quantum physics, without claiming to confirm or deny any spiritual tradition, has arrived at conclusions about the nature of consciousness and reality that are deeply resonant with what these ancient texts described. The physicist David Bohm, one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century, developed the concept of the implicate order, the idea that there exists a dimension of reality underlying the visible world, an order that is not directly perceivable through the physical senses, but that structures and organizes everything that manifests in the visible world. Bohm went as far as to say that consciousness is not produced by the brain, but that the brain functions as a receiver of something much larger, and that this something larger can be influenced and distorted by patterns operating in the implicate order before they ever reach conscious experience. Biologist Rupert Sheldrake, with his theory of morphic fields, proposes that memory and behavioral patterns are stored not only in DNA or neurons, but in invisible fields that extend beyond the limits of the individual physical body. These fields can be influenced, shaped, and loaded with information from previous generations, and also, crucially, by forces external to the individual organism. When Sheldrake describes how these fields can transmit patterns of fear, trauma, and limitation from generation to generation, he is describing, in the language of contemporary science, something the Gnostic texts called archonic inheritance. Psychiatrist and researcher Stanislav Grof, after decades of research into non-ordinary states of consciousness, documented recurring experiences in which individuals from completely different cultures, with no contact with each other, described encounters with entities that presented themselves as benevolent but that revealed, in moments of clarity, a parasitic nature. Grof didn't use the word Archon, but the phenomenological description is identical to what we find in texts 2,000 years old, the same disguise, the same mechanism of energy feeding, the same vulnerability to expanded consciousness and active discernment. What these radically different fields of knowledge, archaeology, theology, quantum physics, morphic field biology, transpersonal psychiatry, are independently confirming is the fundamental structure that Jesus described. There exists a layer of reality that operates on human consciousness invisibly, that uses disguise as its primary strategy, and that can be identified when the human being develops the necessary discernment. This convergence is not coincidence. It is reality revealing itself through multiple windows simultaneously. If this has reached you, it wasn't by accident. Ignoring it is a choice, and every choice has consequences. The digital book is in the first pinned comment. Check it out now. It may not be there tomorrow. Now I want to take you somewhere different in this conversation, because up to this point we've been talking about history, ancient texts, evidence, and suppression. But there is a dimension of this knowledge that only becomes fully alive when you stop treating it as external information and start feeling it as internal experience. And that dimension is the spiritual one, the place where everything that's been said finds its deepest resonance inside you. Jesus, in the Gnostic texts, didn't teach about the archons merely as abstract cosmology. He taught it as part of a path of inner transformation he called gnosis, a Greek word meaning knowledge, but not the intellectual kind you accumulate by reading books. Gnosis was the knowledge that comes from direct experience, from inner contact with truth, from the moment when you stop knowing about something and begin knowing something from the inside out. And on that path, the recognition of the archons and their operation on human consciousness wasn't a secondary theological topic. It was central. It was the very first real step of the liberation journey. The Jewish Kabbalah tradition, which developed in parallel with the Gnostic traditions and shares with them common roots in ancient Jewish mysticism, describes the klippot, literally shells or husks, as forces that envelop divine light and imprison it, that create illusions that block the perception of true spiritual reality. The central spiritual work of the Kabbalist was to identify and move through these klippot, to recognize each illusion for what it was and to liberate the light imprisoned within it. The structural resemblance to the Gnostic description of the archons is not coincidence. These are two different rivers flowing from the same ancient spring of wisdom. Islamic Sufism, in its most interior and least institutionalized tradition, speaks of the nafs, the lower self, with its automatic patterns, its fears, its compulsions, its inner voices that imitate wisdom but serve the ego and separation. Great Sufi masters like Rumi and Ibn Arabi describe a process of purification that is functionally identical to what the Gnostic texts call liberation from archonic control. The recognition of patterns that operate automatically, the honest naming of those patterns, and the development of an inner presence that is not hijacked by them. Tibetan Buddhism, in its practices of the bardo, the intermediate state between death and rebirth, describes encounters with entities that present themselves as gods or enlightened guides, but that reveal their illusory nature when the practitioner maintains presence and discernment. The central teaching in these texts is identical to what Jesus transmitted: do not be seduced by the appearance of light. Test the light. True light does not fear being tested. It does not pressure, does not control, does not take offense when questioned. Indigenous Brazilian, African, and American traditions speak of entities called encostos, shadows, heavy spirits, forms of spiritual influence that attach to human energy and gradually drain whoever carries them of vitality, joy, and clarity. And the healing methods of these traditions, regardless of their specific rituals, share a common principle that is also the central principle of Jesus' Gnostic teaching. You cannot release what you cannot see. The first step is always discernment, recognition, naming. This global convergence is not something that should be dismissed as cultural coincidence. When traditions that never had contact with each other, separated by oceans, centuries, and impenetrable language barriers, independently arrive at the same description of the same spiritual dynamic, with the same practical markers and the same discernment tools, that is evidence of an underlying reality that all these traditions are describing from their own specific vantage point. And Jesus, according to the Gnostic texts, simply articulated that reality with a precision and depth that still has not been surpassed. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, Now is the moment. Hit the button below right now, because what's coming in the next videos is directly built on what we're discovering together here. Every piece of content we publish goes one level deeper than the one before it, and you won't want to miss what's coming. And now I need to ask you a question, and I want you to answer it with complete honesty, just for yourself. Have you ever felt, at any point in your life, that a force you couldn't name was operating against your flourishing? Not a specific person, not an objective circumstance, but something more diffuse, more structural, as if the very pattern of your life was organized in a way that kept you small, exhausted, confused. Drop yes or no in the comments below, because the answer you give is going to reveal something about where you are in your own journey of discernment, and what comes next is going to speak directly to that answer, whatever it is. I want you to stop for a moment, not mentally, for real. Take out your earphones, take a deep breath, and stay with me in this space for a few minutes. Because what I'm about to say is no longer about history. It's no longer about ancient texts or researchers and traditions. It's about you, about your specific life, about what you've been carrying that you may never have been able to name with any precision. Think back to the last time you felt truly energized, truly present, truly alive. Not the last time you were pleasantly distracted, not when you were on your phone, at a show, in a moment of escape, but the last time you felt that your energy was completely intact, that your thoughts were yours, that your joy didn't need to be negotiated with any external circumstance. For some people, that memory is recent. For many others, it's distant, almost forgotten, as though there was a version of themselves that existed before a certain relationship, before a certain environment, before a certain period of life, and that was gradually replaced by something smaller, heavier, more confused. That is not normal, that is not inevitable, and it is not your fault in the way you probably believe it is. The knowledge Jesus transmitted about the Archons was not just cosmology. At its deepest, it was a message of radical human dignity. The central idea of the Gnostic texts is that every human being carries within them a spark of divine light, called pneuma, or spirit, that is genuinely inviolable, genuinely connected to the original source of all that exists, and that the Archons, with all their strategies of disguise, energy draining, and manipulation of judgment, everything they do is built on the premise that you don't know what you carry inside you. Because if you knew, none of it would work. It's that simple. Let me tell you about a woman I'll call Martha. That's not her real name, but the story is completely real. She spent 14 years in a relationship with someone who, in every external aspect, appeared to be an exemplary partner. Attentive. Articulate. Spiritually engaged, he went to church, quoted the Bible, presented himself as a man of principles. But Martha walked away from every conversation feeling like she had given something away. She couldn't identify what. Over time, she lost confidence in her own perceptions. She began to question her emotions, her intuition, her ability to see reality clearly. She got smaller, more dependent, more confused. When she finally had access to the markers Jesus left in the Gnostic texts, the energy theft, the manipulation of judgment, the use of spiritual language as a tool of control, the creation of chronic suffering disguised as virtue, she didn't say this helped me understand my relationship. She said, now I understand my entire life. Because the same patterns that existed in that relationship also existed in the workplace where she spent 10 years exhausted, in the religious group where she grew up being taught that questioning was a sin, in the automatic thoughts that sabotaged every new attempt to flourish. What changed for her wasn't a list of techniques. It wasn't a protocol for spiritual protection. What changed was the ability to see, to recognize the pattern in the moment it appeared, instead of weeks or years later. And that recognition, that simple and radical act of seeing clearly, changed everything. You need to ask yourself, with as much honesty as you can muster, where in my life am I surrendering energy without getting anything equivalent in return? Where am I questioning my own perceptions because someone or some dynamic has trained me not to trust myself? Where am I using the language of virtue, sacrifice, humility, obedience, love, to justify staying in a situation that drains me? And where am I sustaining a suffering I've learned to call spiritual growth, but that isn't making me grow, it's making me shrink? These questions are not comfortable. They weren't meant to be. Jesus, in the Gnostic texts, was not a teacher of comfort. He was a teacher of truth. And the truth, as he made clear repeatedly, is what sets you free. Not blind faith. Not unquestioned obedience. Not suffering accepted as destiny. The truth. Real knowledge. The gnosis that comes from within, that cannot be taken from you by any external force. What you're hearing right now is not ordinary information. It's a truth that few people have the courage to seek. The digital book is in the first pinned comment. Click now. It could disappear at any moment. So, with everything that's been revealed here, the texts, the evidence, the markers, the history of suppression, the convergence of traditions, the depth of what Jesus was actually teaching, the question that remains is this: what do you do with it now? Because knowledge without application is just accumulated information. And accumulated information without transformation is, with a certain irony, exactly what the Archons prefer, because it keeps you busy with intellectual content without ever threatening the control they exercise over your real, everyday life. The first practical step is what the Gnostic texts call vigilance, and Jesus, in the Gospel of Mark, repeats this instruction insistently. Watch. This isn't an instruction about staying physically awake. It's an instruction about keeping your consciousness active, observant, present, especially in moments when you're under emotional pressure, because those are precisely the moments when archonic disguise operates most easily and injected thoughts arrive with the greatest force. Practically speaking, this means building the habit of pausing before reacting, before responding to a message that provoked anger in you, before making a decision in a moment of fear or anxiety, before accepting a narrative about yourself that arrived through a person, an institution, or your own automatic thinking. That pause, 5 seconds, 1 minute, a night's sleep, creates the space where discernment can operate. And in the space of discernment, the disguise cannot hold. The second step is what the Gnostics called tests of the light. Jesus, in the canonical Gospel of John, says something that is rarely applied in the most radical way he intended. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. But knowing the truth requires testing what presents itself as truth. It requires asking, this belief I have about myself, where did it come from? Who benefits when I see myself this way? Is this thought that's paralyzing me moving me toward the light or keeping me in place? This relationship, this environment, this system, is it progressively strengthening me or progressively draining me? A disguised Archon does not survive that question answered honestly. That's why the suppression of discernment is always the first archonic strategy, because without discernment, the disguise is perfect. The third step is what the texts call return to the spark, the regular practice of reconnecting with what you know to be true about yourself at the deepest level, before any conditioning, before any trauma, before any narrative that was imposed on you. It might be meditation, prayer that's genuine and not performative, reflective writing, time in nature. The method doesn't matter. What matters is creating space where the deepest voice of your own self can be heard, distinguished from the voices that were installed by external influences over time. The fourth step, and this is the one that is simultaneously the most liberating and the most frightening, is the deliberate choice to exit dynamics where the draining has been identified. Not in an explosion, not in drama, not in confrontation that feeds the archonic dynamic even further through emotional conflict, but in a clear, sovereign movement grounded in discernment. The calm exit of someone who knows what they're doing and why. That calmness is, in itself, the proof that archonic control has been broken, because the forces that feed on low-frequency emotions have no power over someone who acts from serene clarity. There is a person who wrote to this channel, I won't share details that would identify her, who said she watched a piece of content about spiritual discernment and decided to apply these 4 principles in a work environment that had been draining her for 3 years. She didn't quit immediately. She started to observe, to pause before reacting, to test the thoughts that arrived loaded with urgency and fear. And over 90 days, something unexpected happened. She didn't need to leave. The environment shifted around her, because she had stopped providing the fuel that the dysfunctional dynamic needed to sustain itself. The behavior of the people around her changed. The whole atmosphere changed. As if the very presence of discernment, the presence of active vigilance, had dissolved something that had previously seemed solid and immovable. That is what Jesus promised. Not a life free from challenges. Not magical protection from every adversity, but the real, concrete, practical power of true knowledge, of gnosis, that cannot be taken from those who genuinely possess it. Every day we receive messages from people who have found comfort, hope, and strength through this channel. And that's only possible because there is a community that believes in this mission. If you feel that this content has made a difference in your life and you'd like to help us continue bringing this message to more people, I've left a support link in the first pinned comment. Your contribution helps us keep this work alive and reach even more families, homes, and hearts. If you decide to contribute, Know that your help is part of this mission. Thank you for walking this path with us. We've reached the end of a journey that started with a disturbing question and ends with something far more powerful than any answer: the ability to see. Jesus revealed how to recognize a disguised Archon, not to create paranoia, not to generate fear of everything and everyone, but to set you free, so that you would never again lose your energy, your judgment, and your light without at least understanding what was happening. The Gnostic texts, the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, the historical evidence, and the convergences with traditions from around the world all point in the same direction. There is a force that operates through disguise, and there is a knowledge that dissolves it. You received access to that knowledge today. Thousands of people have already accessed the digital book and said they will never look at this subject the same way again. The link is in the first pinned comment. You decide whether you want to be part of that group. If you made it here, you're already different. Most people dropped off early because the truth carries a weight that not everyone is ready to bear. But you stayed. You listened. And that says a great deal about who you are and where you are in your journey. If this video opened something inside you, if something landed in a way you couldn't quite articulate before, hit like right now. That simple gesture makes an enormous difference in getting this content to more people who need it. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell, because every video we publish goes one level deeper than the last, and you're not going to want to miss what comes next. And for those who made it to the very end, those who genuinely stuck around all the way through, drop the words "inner lie gauged" in the comments right now. I want to see the warriors who had the courage to go all the way to the finish. And check out the video that's showing on your screen now. You won't want to miss it. It connects directly to everything we just covered, and what it reveals is going to make everything we discussed today even clearer and even more transformative.